sink in shame with all his deeds denied. Shall slander rest upon the fame of one so true and tried? Shall he be cast aside in doubt and wield no more the sword? Rise then and turn his scorners out, and Mac shall be restored. Brave Mac is bound to win the day, and our good cause to save. The jealous hatred dares to lay its hand upon the brave. Oh, then lift up the song of praise for him who leads us on, and let us hope for brighter days when victory shall be won.
Good evening, and welcome to the second Ulster County History Mini Conference. This one dedicated to the vote, how it came about, and we're up to where we are today. I don't know, I grew up in a more innocent time where I was taught one person, one vote. And as I've gotten older and struggled and learned how that has not been a straight line, and that for many people in this country, they have had to fight to get it, and then they have had to fight to keep it. And now we find ourselves in a time when the very right to vote and how we vote and all the apparatus of voting is being called into question. So it should be a very interesting next few months. And when Joan Kelley first suggested this as a topic for a conference, it struck me as being just the perfect time for that to come about. So I think that I would like to start off this evening by turning the screen over to Nina Pasterpak, the Ulster County Clerk, who has agreed to welcome us all on behalf of the county. Nina, as many of you know, is a champion of local history, and I really have enjoyed getting to know her and working with her all these years. So if Nina, can we bring her up?
Yeah, hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. I don't know why my video is not working. Can you hear me at least?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize for that. For some reason, my iPad is not allowing me to go to the video mode. So I apologize for that. I'm very grateful to be here this evening. And Jeff, thank you so much. We are so blessed in this community to have Jeff Miller, and for all his initiatives and his motivation to put things such as this history conference together. So I thank you so much for inviting me. And I think the topic tonight is so timely, the evolution of voting rights in New York State. And you know, how appropriate is it in a year that we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, that we're honored to have 4 women presenters speaking on the progression of voting in New York State. So thank you to Joan Kelley, Susan Lewis, Ashley Dittus, and Cynthia Bowles, Cindy, for all that you're doing this evening, and for you allowing us to really walk through history and see how our voting rights started and where we are today. So tonight, as we delve into the history of the women's suffrage movement in New York State and look at the development of voting rights, it's important to note that 3 years before the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, New York State became one of the first states on the East Coast to ratify women's right to vote. But change came well before that. And I have to say, New York State was on the cutting edge back then, and as we are today. But this year, we're also celebrating another milestone, not only the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote, but the 150th anniversary of the passing of the 15th Amendment of the United States, which allowed the first African-American, which was Mundy Peterson of Perth Amboy, New Jersey, who had the right to vote in that first election. He cast his vote on March 31st, 1870. So that was over 150 years ago. These two anniversaries represent defining moments in the history of our country. And I think tonight it will become apparent that over the past 150 years, many individuals struggled and fought to ensure every American had the right to cast a ballot. We'll hear about organizations like the League of Women Voters who have defended, protected, and encouraged every citizen of the state to exercise this right. We will see the significant impact that New York State made on voting rights, not only in our state, but nationally. And we owe so much to these individuals who came before us, who struggled and fought and preserved and persevered so we could participate in the political process, the most important form of our most hallowed rights, which were outlined in the Constitution, the right to vote. So I want to quote someone tonight. Franklin Roosevelt said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people the right to vote, except the American people themselves. And the only way that they could do this is by not voting." So I really want to say tonight, with all the turmoil and unrest that our state and country are facing during this pandemic, President Roosevelt's words could not be more true. Tonight's presentation will reinforce the responsibilities we have to those who came before us, the responsibility to cast our vote and have our voices heard on election day. Such an important right. And tonight we will discuss how that became from early 150 years ago to today. So I thank everyone for being here tonight. I thank you for allowing me to participate in this conference. And Jeff, thank you so much for all that you do.
Thanks, Nita. Thanks a lot. So I see a lot of familiar faces here. That's very nice, and welcome, and thanks for your support of these conferences. I see a lot of old friends here. That's really, really great. Thanks a lot all for coming. So we'll get right to it. The first talk by Joan Kelley is before the 15th Amendment and going on from there. So Joan is currently the chair of the Archives Subcommittee of Historic Huguenot Street. She's the archivist of Christ Episcopal Church of Poughkeepsie, and she recently became the town of Lloyd historian, which is when I first began to know her. So, and she's been a great participant on the committee that organizes these conferences. So I do also want to thank Susan Stessen-Cohen, Susan Sprackman, Richard Hepner, Marnie Jansen, Audrey Klinkenberg, and I'm probably forgetting someone in there. So yeah. Because my poor brain is not quite as active as it used to be in terms of remembering names, but there are a lot of people that care about the history in Ulster County and are working to bring this to us, and Joan is one of them. So welcome, Joan, and if we can put Joan on.
Okay, I have a technical assistant. Karen is going to handle the PowerPoint presentation, so that should show up here soon. The suspense is awesome.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just getting it.
Like the debates, I'll have to see whether this cuts into my allotted time slot.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is a disclaimer. The terms that I'm using in this presentation to describe African Americans are those found in the original records, and they reflect the social and cultural standards of the time. The words and terms are included here not to endorse those standards, but to report the content of the records as accurately as possible. Okay, next. Karen's going to flip slides for me. Good. Okay, so the story actually started about a century before the American Revolution. Back in 1683, New York was divided up into the 12 original counties. Ulster was one of those counties. The government at that time consisted of a governor who was appointed by the king, a council who was appointed by the governor, and the assembly was actually elected by voters. So we actually had people voting in New York back in 1683. It kind of had a shaky start because we had kings of England coming and going, and we had the Leisler Rebellion. But by the time we got to 1699, they had defined who a voter was. It was a person 21 years old, dwelling and resident in lands that were improved to the value of 40 pounds for at least 3 months before the election. And it also included freemen of either New York City or Albany. Freemen in this case not only meant those who were not enslaved and those who were not indentured servants, but freemen actually were artisans and merchants who had achieved a certain amount of recognition. If you think of it like a licensed plumber, that's what the freemen were. They were artisans and merchants who were approved in that city. And the elections were conducted by the sheriff. Next. So the Revolutionary War came, and New York State drafted a constitution in Kingston. That's why we said it started here. So in 1777, New York became a state, and the governmental structure they approved was very similar to what they had before. They had a governor, senators, 24 were elected from 4 Senate districts, and 70 assemblymen were elected from 14 districts. And the inscription you see here is where the Constitution was adopted and read from the Kingston courthouse. This actually happened about 6 months before the burning of Kingston. Next. So who was allowed to vote? It was interesting. It was a 2-tiered system. If someone was a freeholder that held 100 pounds, so this meant somebody who owned land and his equity was at least 100 pounds, he could vote for his governors and senators. If you weren't that well off, if you owned 20 pounds worth of freehold and you were resident for 6 months and paid taxes, or you rented, or you were a resident of Albany and New York who was a freeman, then you could vote for assemblyman. So you had to have some wealth in order to vote for the highest 2 officers. It's also interesting to note that the election for president they were elected by electors. It wasn't there was no popular election until 1824. Okay, next. The reasons they used for these qualifications, they said, well, only freeholders should vote because only they had a permanent stake in the stability of society. They paid the bulk of taxes. The freemen from Albany and New York, they were kind of a holdover from the earlier law. And the rationale for excluding other people was, well, if a voter lacked economic independence, they feared that the people who controlled his livelihood could manipulate his vote. So this argument was used against women, against blacks, against servants, so forth. Okay, next. So this is a picture of what election day looked like. It was a party. You see here, we have all men. We have a fair amount of alcohol, and whoever was ready to vote would step up and address the election official and announce to everyone who he was voting for, and then his vote would be tallied. So the interesting thing is several of these people could not read and write. So this was probably the best way of, getting their votes recorded. This is actually yeah. Okay, so the interesting thing is the politicians kept track of how this was going. So it turned out there were 6 elector censuses that were taken between 1790 and 1821. And you see here, this is an elector census from the county of Ulster. And if you look, there's 3 columns. So the first column is the upper tier land freeholders who could vote for the governor and the senators. And the next 2 columns were the lower tiered voters who could vote for assemblymen. So you see about 2/3 of the voters were qualified to vote for the upper 2 offices. Okay, next. By the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783, the Federalist Party was the strongest party, and they supported abolition of slavery, but the whole idea of suffrage was still a hard sell. They did manage to get through a law in 1788 that ended slave trade. And in 1799, we had the gradual manumission law, which eventually freed all of the slaves in 1827. Then the power shifted to the other party. And the names of these parties aren't what they are today, but the opposing party was the Republican Democratic Party, who was not a supporter of abolition. And in 1811, they started putting more requirements on Black men. So then Black men were required to file a proof of freedom before they could vote. Bear in mind that 1827 is the time when all the African Americans were freed in New York. This is an example of a certificate of freedom that we found in the Ulster County Archives. It's for Anthony Hogeboom in 1811. And it describes him, it tells him when he was freed, where he lives, and he's got someone there to certify that he's good to go. So this Tremper who signed it apparently was a supporter of abolition. Next. And a couple of years later in 1815, they put additional requirements on Black men voting in New York City. So here you see an example of the forms that these people had to fill out. If you're doing any kind of African-American research, these are a gold mine because they name the parents, they name the place where they were born, they name when they were freed. But the problem was they also required a fee to file them. So that pretty much discouraged anybody who was attempting to vote at this point. Next. In 1821, they had the second constitutional convention. The first constitutional convention had happened about 20 years earlier, and it was basically a rewrite of the judiciary functions. So in 1821, they did another rewrite of the state constitution. Some wanted to include text in there that said every white male age 21. That's how the requirement started. That was successfully opposed by Peter Jay, who was the son of John Jay, the pretty famous Supreme Court judge here. So instead of doing that, what they did is they put property ownership and tax payment required on men of color. And by the time they put those requirements on, very few could meet those requirements. They justified it by saying, well, we have no taxation without representation. So we're going to not tax these people so we don't have to give them representation. And it was put to a vote and 64% of New York voters approved the new constitution. Next. So this is an example of the initial constitution that was drawn up in 1777 and the one in 1821. And you'll notice that the property ownership disappears in 1821. There's still a property tax requirement. And then if we look at the next one, but now you see that for men of color, they have higher residency requirements. They are required to own property worth $250 above all mortgages, and they were required to pay property tax. And again, this justification, well, if they're not paying property tax, they really don't have to vote. So this was the change made in 1821. Okay, next. So it turns out that the politicians are actively watching this. And in the New York State censuses of 1825 through 1845, you see the columns here on the right where they list how many people are voting. Then they list, okay, we have aliens and paupers. And then you see 3 columns that are whole number of persons colored not taxed. Of course, they can't vote. Whole number of persons of color who are taxed. And then the whole number of persons of color who are taxed and qualified to vote. Now, the problem is, this is pretty interesting, but in 1911, there was a huge fire in the up in Albany, and most of the 1825 to 1845 censuses were burned up. Fortunately, someone had done summaries on them before they burned up, so we have some of this information. The following 2 censuses in 55 through 75 only enumerated the persons of color who were not taxed. Of course, they couldn't vote. And those censuses did list all the people in the household. So those are still around in most cases. A few of them in Ulster are missing. So let's take a look at the summary. Here's a summary of the 1825 census of Ulster County. You see the towns, and if you look at the last 3 columns, you can see the number of colored persons not taxed. Of course, they can't vote. Then the next column is the number of colored persons who are taxed. And the last column shows you how many persons of color are allowed to vote. So you can see that the law was doing exactly what they had intended it to do. Okay, next. Here's just one line, the town of New Paltz. You see there's 864 people who could vote, 35 aliens, 15 paupers, 278 colored men who were not taxed, and none of them are allowed to vote. Okay, next. We also have a summary of 1835. In 1826, the tax requirement was removed for white voters. So now white voters didn't have to own property. They didn't have to pay taxes. Any white voter over 21 could vote. But the requirements are still in place for the colored people. You can see from the last 3 columns, they aren't changing much. Here's New Paltz. You can see because there's the requirement to pay taxes gone, the number of voters in New Paltz is now from 864 up to 1,112. We have 52 aliens, 116 paupers. The poorhouse was built in New Paltz in 1828. So that's why you see the big jump in paupers. And we have 216 colored not taxed, and we have 1 allowed to vote. Next. as time went on, there was an increased focus in civil rights. You have William Lloyd Garrison establishing the Liberator, Black newspapers. Governor Seward was pretty supportive of abolition. He got laws passed so that there was trial by jury for fugitive slaves, and New York public schools were open to all children. In addition, we had more Yankees from New England moving to Western and Northern New York, and they were more supportive of abolition. Next. The third Constitutional Convention, now they were required to have them every 20 years, had two items on the ballot. They said, do you want to approve the rewritten Constitution? And the eligibility section didn't change. And they made a separate item to say, shall we repeal the property requirement for colored male citizens? Okay, so by making it a separate item to be approved, they kind of shirked their responsibility for saying we want to keep it in place. Next. Also, in this, this is an explanation of how the election is to be conducted. Now they said you have to have a ballot. No more of this walking up and saying what you were going to do. So now what you did is you walked up and you asked for a ballot. And the ballot was for a particular item. In this case, it was for the Constitution property qualification. That was what was on the outside of the ballot. And you walked up and said, okay, give me a ballot that says, yes, I want equal suffrage for colored persons, or no, I don't. And they gave you that ballot and you put it in the ballot box. Okay, next. Here's a tally sheet from the 1846 election in Ulster County. And you see the last two columns are the tally on the suffrage question. And the first column is, yes, I approve of suffrage. No, I don't. So you can see in Ulster County, 4% said, yes, I approve, and 95% said no. And overall in the state, it was defeated about 27% for and 73% against. There was renewed interest. There's 3 different acts that actually made people start thinking more about favoring Black suffrage, especially the Dred Scott decision, where it was decided that Black people were not citizens of the United States. Suffrage was opposed by the Democratic Party because they feared the loss of jobs for white working class and immigrants. 47% of New York City residents were foreign born in 1680. And they said, if we give them the right to vote, they're all going to vote for the other party, which is something, I guess, an idea we've heard expressed recently. And they said it's going to bring on the Civil War. Okay, next. So this is an example of the ballot for 1860. And this, they changed it a little bit. So now you're voting for property qualification for colored men or against. So you'd get one of these ballots and put it in the bucket. Again, it was defeated, but now by a smaller margin. 63% voted to retain the property qualification for colored men. And most of the counties who voted against it were the ones who were in the western and northern parts of New York. Okay, so we have the end of the Civil War. We have the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment that says everyone born in the US is a citizen. Next. And then we have another constitutional convention. Well, at this one, they tried to get some women's suffrage items, and they used the same thing. Okay, the no taxation without representation. Well, Blacks, you justified them not voting because you said they don't pay tax, but women pay tax, but you're not allowing them to vote. Well, the women's suffrage was not even included in the final draft that was voted on. So we'll hear more about that later. The Committee on the Right to Suffrage recommended that now you really should allow Blacks to vote because they were indiscriminately drafted to help in the Civil War. And I remember during the Vietnam War where the similar argument was used that 18-year-olds should be allowed to vote because they're being drafted. So there was a separate amendment to retain the property right for men of color, and it was narrowly approved. So the property requirement was still in place. Okay, next. Then the 15th Amendment came along and it said, no citizen shall be denied voting rights because of race, color, and that law applied to everyone in the United States. You couldn't have a separate state that had their own thing. This was national law. Some of the women's suffrage groups opposed this because they felt that, you know, that would drag down their cause. And some of the Black suffrage groups opposed the women's suffrage because they felt it would drag down their cause. And Sojourner Truth said, well, I'll support both. I'll get half the problem solved. Okay, next. So in 1869, the New York State Senate ratified the 19th Amendment, or the 15th Amendment. Then there was an election and a different party gained power. So on the first day of the new session, they elected officers, and Boss Tweed then offered a joint resolution to repeal their approval of the 15th Amendment, which passed. Fortunately, they needed 27 states to approve the ratification, and New York was the 28th. So New York State finally rescinded their recession on March 30 of 1970. Okay, so this is a summary of all the different changes in voting that occurred in New York State, all the different items that were on the ballot. The ones in blue are the ones that are specific to New York State. And then you see the ones in green are the amendments that were made to the Constitution of the United States, which covered all of the states. So you can see it was a long time coming. I put some references here for additional reading if anybody's interested. And Karen says she's going to make these available in the chat. And at the seminar before this one, somebody asked if there were any resources for people researching African Americans. So I have to plug my free webinar that I'm giving on October 30, which talks about researching African Americans in the Hudson Valley. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks, Joan. Thanks a lot. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping, I think I neglected to turn the mic over to Susan Sprackman at the beginning of the conference, because if you had questions about Joan's presentation or any of the other presentations, the way to deal with that is to put the questions in the chat, and that would be then given to Susan Sprackman, who's going to facilitate the question and answer period for all of the presenters at the end of this program. So,
and what we'll try to do is to group the questions. So your question may not come out exactly as you submitted it, but it may come out as a group with other similar questions.
And I'm sorry, Susan, for forgetting that detail.
It's okay. It gave me a chance to eat my salad.
Okay. Thanks a lot. So the next person to present is Susan Lewis. who I have not had the opportunity to meet, though I have heard a lot about her. And she is a professor emeritus of history from New Paltz, and she's affiliate faculty member of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department at SUNY New Paltz. She has numerous publications to her name and is a fellow of the New York Academy of History and author of the blog New York Rediscovered. And the topic of her presentation is women's suffrage in New York State. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Karen is going to put up my PowerPoint. I'm very glad to be here. And I'm going to look at the time to make sure that I don't take more than 20 minutes. And if I start to take more, somebody, just like in my class, has to raise your hand and tell me enough. Okay. So my talk is called Beyond Susan B. Anthony. Can everybody hear me? I'm good? All right. And it's about who really won the vote for women in New York State and the United States. Okay, next. And I've got to tell you, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony did not get the vote for women in New York State or the USA because they died and they failed. I'm sorry. You know, they were wonderful in some ways. They were far-seeing. They were committed. They were passionate. They worked really, really hard, but they didn't succeed. So I've been somewhat upset by the centennial events, both in 2017 and this year, and the statue that's now in Central Park, because I feel as if we've been celebrating women's suffrage as it's almost as if we decided to celebrate the civil rights movement by talking about Frederick Douglass and never mentioning Martin Luther King. So now I'm going to try to mention the women who I think were most responsible for the final suffrage victory. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to ask you to ask yourselves, who would you say? What names occur to you if we're not going to mention Stanton and Anthony, either for New York in 1917 or the United States in 1920? And if nothing occurs, I want you to ask yourselves, why we don't know the names of these people. Okay, next. So the two major leaders, I think everybody would agree nationally, were Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. Catt lived from 1859 to 1947. She's on the left. Alice Paul from 1885 to 1977. She's on the right. And you can see there are different generations. Catt is a generation older than Paul. Yeah, not done yet. Okay. Catt is a generation older than Paul. She's not as photogenic, which is perhaps part of her problem. She did her work somewhat behind the scenes. Everybody knew who she was. She was very famous, but she did her work. You see her on the phone, you see her at a desk. She did a lot of lobbying. That didn't make a good picture. Alice Paul was more, as we'll see, confrontational and photogenic. And that may be part of the reason why her name is more familiar. Okay, I'm ready for the next one. So they were leaders of two different organizations. I know we want the suffragists to agree, but they didn't agree. In fact, they hated each other. Both in 1869, when the suffrage movement splits, and when women get the vote in 1920. They were committed to different tactics. Okay, next. So Catt today is considered more moderate and mainstream. I have to say, when she's organizing in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s, she was considered radical because she wanted the vote for women. And I have to tell you that most women in the United States did not want the vote and did not think women needed the vote before the 20th century. So, you know, if you think it's just men who are against women voting, that's just not true at all. There was a huge female anti-suffrage movement. And there's a book about it actually for New York State. So Kat is the head of a group called NWASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It forms in 1890 out of the two suffrage organizations that had split over the 15th Amendment back in 1869. And by the time women get the vote, NWASA has about 2 million members. Kat is president from 1900 to 1904, and again from 1915 to 1920. So this is the key period in my mind. My students always want everything to be baby steps and each thing is equally important. No, historical change does not happen that way. There is a movement, but there's a big push right before victory. Kat was Susan B. Anthony's chosen successor. Anthony decides she's going to carry on because Anthony knows she's going to die. She knows that she's not going to see victory in her lifetime. You know, it's sad, but that's true. Kat was a brilliant organizer, campaign strategist, and she was compared to a general. She talked about her troops and her army. Sometimes she was called Napoleon. And what did she do? She organized lobbyists to convince male politicians and male voters to support suffrage. Why? Because that was the only way women could get the vote. They couldn't get it any other way. They had to convince men that they needed and deserved the vote. So for instance, in the recent PBS series says, women weren't given the vote. That's true. They took it. Lie. There was no way they could take it. There was no taking. What were they going to take? Did they foment a rebellion? No, they convinced men that they deserved it. Next. Alice Paul, on the other hand, was quite radical and militant. Her party was called the National Women's Party. She was radicalized in England, although she never went as far as the English suffragists who were actually, they broke windows and chained themselves to buildings and broke up meetings, things like that. She didn't go down that road. But she joins NWASA. She's not happy with what they're doing. She joins their congressional committee because NWASA is working through the states to get suffrage state by state, as we got it in New York. Paul thinks that's taken too long. And so she eventually forms this party that just focuses on the federal amendment and more confrontational tactics. Okay, next. And I would say that Alice Paul is better known today, at least from my experience, talking to students. One of the reasons is the National Women's Party picketed the White House during World War I. So this was actually the first group ever to picket the White House. They start before the war, but they continue during the war. And they have somewhat inflammatory signs like Kaiser Wilson, set women free. And when you're comparing the president during a war to the enemy leader, they become attacked, then they're arrested, not their attackers. They go to jail, they come back out, they go to jail again. Eventually, they go on hunger strikes in jail, they're force-fed, and this is a Hollywood movie, right? Iron-jawed angels. Next. But I have to say that Alice Paul was not from New York, and she wasn't that active in New York. She's focused on the federal amendment. She thought the state campaigns were failures and a waste of time and energy. She organized things like the famous parade the day before Woodrow Wilson's 1913 inauguration. And we see here actually a New Yorker, Inez Mulholland, who led the parade on a white horse. And this comes very symbolic of the suffrage movement and of that parade. And Mulholland was interesting because she went to Vassar, and the president of Vassar would not allow any suffrage discussion on campus. So she actually organized a meeting in a cemetery in Poughkeepsie so that the women could all, go there and talk about suffrage. But Mulholland was an ally of Paul's. She organizes with her, but she eventually, while she's campaigning before the vote is won, She collapses, she dies, and she is the suffrage martyr. And people have become much more interested in her in recent years. Okay, next. Okay, but so despite the fact I'm saying she's important, she's dramatic, but we're not going to talk about Alice Paul. Well worth looking into. Instead, we're going to focus on New York suffrage leaders between 1914 and 1917 and the tactics that they had that were successful. Okay. In 1915, no states east of the Mississippi allowed women full suffrage. Sometimes they could vote in school elections, or they could vote, there are different things that they were allowed to vote for in some states. But there wasn't one single state that allowed women full suffrage. Okay, next. And you see here the maps. Women could vote in all these Western states. They had full suffrage. They had full suffrage in Wyoming since 1869 when it became a territory, and since 1890 when it became a state. So in 1915, there's this huge push and they say, this just is ridiculous. Women can vote. They are voting. The country hasn't fallen apart. We need to move this east. Next. And there are campaigns in 4 major eastern states: New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, and all of them lose, every single one. And this is devastating to the people who've worked on them. Okay, next. You see her on the left, Leslie's magazine. And this is right before the election, right? It's October 28th. And you've got a picture of a woman dressed as a Minuteman with taxation without representation. So there is some support in the press. Although, by the way, the New York Times was always against women's suffrage. And then you see the button, equal franchise for New York, 1915. Tremendous amount of canvassing, speaking, marching, publicity, failure. Okay, next. So when I started looking at suffrage, and I am not a suffrage scholar, my area of expertise is actually 19th century business women, but I was teaching and I wanted to know more about this. And I asked myself, why did the New York referendum lose in 1915 and win in 1917, right? And why is New York the first state east of the Mississippi to give women the vote? What made this difference? Well, after maybe, I don't know, I started working on this in 2013. New Paltz had a conference in 2017. It's now 2020. And I would just say, I've decided it's because the suffragists picked up the campaign the next day. They call Carrie Chapman Catt on the phone after she loses, and they say, well, what are you going to do now? This is terrible. What are you going to do? And she said, well, I'm going to get up tomorrow morning and we're going to start organizing again. And we're going to have a meeting in 2 nights and we're going to raise $1 million. And that's what they do. Okay, next. So what were the tactics that I think were most responsible? This is a long-term effort, right? I'm not saying that it was equally successful the whole time, but they've been working on it a long time. They have rural support as well as urban support. They're African-American women. They're working class women. They're male supporters. They're wealthy women. They needed everyone. There's a history of women getting the vote in New York called Women Will Vote by Susan Goodyear and Karen Pastorello. And Susan would say, it was a beautiful patchwork. They all had to play their part, and everybody had to get together, and then it worked. However, other people, when they're analyzing, say, well, what puts it over in 1917? New York City. The vote in New York City changes. Where does it change? immigrant men, especially Jewish immigrant socialist men, all come out for women's suffrage in 1917. Another influence is their support for World War I. My own mother always claimed that this was the reason women got the vote. Carrie Catt had been a lifelong pacifist. She hated World War I. But when she saw that the United States was going to be involved in the war, she decides they have to support the war. They have to go for patriotism because otherwise they're not going to get suffrage. She doesn't drop the suffrage campaign. Stanton and Anthony had actually dropped their campaign during the Civil War, which is one of the reasons they're so bitter in 1869, that now they've done all this stuff for abolition and they're not getting the vote. But Carrie Catt, one of the brilliant things about her was she said, we can do both. We can do it all. So we can do everything we need to for the war effort and we'll work for suffrage at the same time. Meanwhile, the anti-suffragists totally dropped their campaign to work on the war effort. In the period between 1915 and 1917, there are all these public entertainments. There are parades, performances, there's suffrage memorabilia, there's suffrage swag, they have suffrage soap. They speak to huge groups of men. They canvass door to door. In New York City, they go to every single apartment to canvass. Other historians argue that what happens in the 20th century is that suffrage goes from frumpy to fashionable. The suffrage leaders in the 19th century, they're so serious, they're not very stylish. But by the 20th century, and certainly by this period, 1917, there are a lot of society women and people who are written up all the time who are supporting suffrage. It's just become a mass movement. And finally, they get 1 million women's signatures on the suffrage petition for 1917, right? So no one can say anymore that women don't want to vote. She's got 1 million women who've signed that they want to vote. Okay, next. So I am going to argue, obviously, that the people whose names we want to remember are Carrie Chapman Catt and Mary Garrett Hay. That doesn't mean that there weren't other people who were important. But, women don't like to say that some people are more important, actually. Men's historians don't seem to mind that. Women's historians always want to say, there were so many people and they had unheard voices. But if women do not have leaders and heroes, then we're just going to think that there were no women leaders and heroes, and only men had leaders and heroes, and everybody else was an unheard voice. These people were not unheard. Okay, let's keep going. Carrie Lane. She's born in Wisconsin. She grows up in Iowa, so she's from the Midwest. And she is radicalized when she's a kid and all the men in her family are getting, and the hired hands and everything, they're getting ready to vote. And her mother's not getting dressed to go to town. She says, Mom, what's going on? She said, well, women can't vote. She's furious. And from that moment on, she's a suffragist. She goes to college because women could go to those Midwestern universities. She works her way through school as a teacher. She's the only woman in her graduating class and the valedictorian. She's a school teacher, a law clerk. She's the first female superintendent of schools in Mason City, Iowa. This is in her early 20s. So she's already a big achiever. Next. She marries a newspaper editor and they get in trouble. I forget exactly what they say, but they get in local trouble and he goes to California to find a job and he dies. So when she gets out to California, he has yellow fever or something. She gets there and she has to make her own living. And she tries to make a living as a journalist, but she finds that there's a lot of sexual, not abuse, right? It's when they try to abuse you, but you avoid them. That was basically her situation. She goes back to Iowa. She begins suffrage organizing and speaking. And in 1890, she meets an old friend who'd always been in love with her from college. And he wants to marry her. And she said, okay, as long as I can organize for suffrage 6 months a year. In that case, I'll marry you. So he says yes, and she does. Next slide. And she spends 6 months organizing or more. Then she succeeds Susan B. Anthony, but her husband becomes ill, so she resigns. And then he dies, and Susan B. Anthony, who she's very close to, dies, and her younger brother dies, and her mother dies, and she gets depressed. So she's told she should travel for her health. So she goes around the world organizing for suffrage. And you can see her here in the New York Times, Mrs. Cat crusading around the world for suffrage. This is what she did when she took time off. Okay, next. She also gets $1 million for suffrage. And I think this is very telling. There was a publishing entrepreneur whose name was Miriam Leslie, and she leaves Cat personally $1.7 million. After the court fights, it's $1 million. And then Cat has that money herself. And she sets up a fund, but she controls it. Anytime you want to have a successful movement, you've got to have money. You need money for PR, you need money for headquarters, you need money to travel. And so I think the fact that it's given to her is very symbolic. Okay, next. And victorious. She becomes head of NWASA in 1915. She announces her famous winning plan. In 1916, she says, we're going to work on the states where we can win, and we're going to work on the federal amendment at the same time. In 1917, as we saw, New York passes the suffrage referendum, and that's really important. She calls that Gettysburg, because it's the turning point. New York is the most populous state with the biggest congressional delegation. And therefore, once New York is for suffrage, it has a far better chance to pass Congress. And she personally cultivates President Wilson. By the way, President Wilson hated Alice Paul, and she hated him. President Wilson is quite friendly with Carrie Chapman Catt. And in 1920, the suffrage amendment is finally ratified. And I could tell you why I know she's so important, but I think, let's go to the next slide. I wanted to say a word about Mary Garrett Hay, who is they're buried together. Let's just say that. Cat chose not to be buried with either of her husbands. She chose to be buried with Mary Garrett Hay. She runs the New York City campaign in 1917 and convinces Tammany Hall not to oppose women's vote. And the way she does it is she gets Tammany Hall wives to be part of her organization. So once she does that, Tammany Hall backs off. And another reason Tammany Hall backs off is that Wilson comes out in favor of the New York referendum. And so, he's the Democratic president, so they back off. Okay, next. So who have I left out of this story? I think I'm running out of time, so we'll go really quickly through these. Next. I just want to introduce you to 3 people. Mary Burnett Talbert, who was called the most famous Black woman in America during her lifetime. Of course, till I studied suffrage, I had never heard of her. She's one of the founders of the NAACP. She's an anti-lynching activist, a suffragist. She's the person responsible for preserving Frederick Douglass's home in Washington. And she asked suffragists to incorporate the ideals of racial justice and to integrate their organizations. They do not do so. Why? Because they're convinced that they'll never get votes in the South. And in fact, in the end, the last state to ratify women's suffrage is Tennessee. But in New York, African-American women suffrage groups and, the mainstream white women's suffrage groups work together because African-American women do win the vote in New York. Next. Rose Schneiderman, she represents the working woman, the union members. She's the person who coined the term, women need bread, but they need roses too, suggesting that working women should make a little bit more than a bare necessity. And you can see here from this poster, she spoke extensively for the 1917 campaign and was possibly the person who convinced all those Jewish socialist men that they should be voting for women's suffrage. Next. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, one of the richest women in the United States. You see her in her ball gown in the 1880s, but in around 1909, I think, she's a widow. She decides to put her resources behind suffrage. And she even uses Marble House in Newport as a place for suffrage events. She funds both groups, by the way. She gives both of them money. So she gives money to Kat's group and she gives money to Paul's group. Next. And all these unknown people, right? We have no idea who these young women were. They're spreading the word on Wall Street. Next. This is so sad. Carrie Chapman Catt said, 100 years from now, the deeds of present day mayors will be forgotten, but the children of the centuries to come will learn that on November 6, 1917, a great step for human freedom was accomplished in the state of New York. I grew up in the state of New York, and I'm sure that I never heard a word about this, right? And to me, this is an example of how little we know about women's suffrage. The greatest enhancement, the greatest, what am I trying to say? It's like the most number of people, the greatest expansion of democracy in American history. And what do we know about it? Next. Okay, and this is where she's talking about all the things that they did. They were heard in the church, the theater, the baseball field, and even the circus. Next. And there is so much more to be learned. I have only scratched the surface. So thank you for listening to me. I hope you've learned something.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. And I hope that people had questions and were putting them in the chat so we could have a chance to talk a little bit more about this at the end of the program. And so thank you. Now we're going to move to Ashley Dittus, who's going to be talking, I believe, about the extension of the vote, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and what happened in the 1960s. So is Ashley there? Hi, Ashley. Welcome.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a PowerPoint, if I could share my screen. Okay. Okay, so thank you for everyone for inviting me to this. When Richard Hepner asked me to present tonight on voting reforms post-1960s, I was excited to take on this challenge. I am not a historian. I am an elections commissioner for Ulster County. I'm the Democratic commissioner. So my work is very much in the present, in the here and now. But this year, however, I have developed an appreciation for our place in history and the work that our office does and how it impacts generations to come. So this year we're facing a once-in-a-generation pandemic while also planning for and implementing what is expected to be the most impactful election of our lifetime. So how we conduct our work this year is going to have lasting implications. So what I've done in this presentation is taking reforms that we've had since the 60s, including the Voting Rights Act and others, and how those really frame the work that we do still to this day. Many of them are relevant to this election, and they serve as a roadmap to how we conduct the vote now. And many of these laws are still actively applied to the registrants of 2020. The sources that I had on a lot of these implementations and how they affected the local way that we conduct them in Ulster County comes from my predecessors. Every year, the two commissioners of the Board of Elections are responsible for reporting and reflecting on the past year's election. As their modern contemporary, I know how these reports are crafted. We want to put the best light on the work that we've done, even if it was challenging in some years more so than others. So while the source text is definitely biased, in that way, I'm uniquely qualified to read through that bias and really suss out what really was probably happening on the ground. So I'm going to start. Let me start the presentation part. Okay. So yeah, in the 1960s, obviously, the Voting Rights Act is the premier legislation that was passed on a federal level. That really reinforced the 14th and 15th Amendment prohibiting racial discrimination in voting. That was very impactful in the Deep South, but it had implications across the whole country, and including Ulster County. So we saw a lot of changes in that decade. It was a decade of a lot of emergence of usually more typically disenfranchised voters and unheard voices, minorities, and women. In the 1964 presidential election, women cast more ballots than men for the first time in Ulster County, and they've continued to do that in the years since. So that was a big shift in how women are viewed, especially by politicians and by campaigns. You see that in Ulster County really starting to emerge in the 60s. The League of Women Voters established in Ulster County, becoming a standard bearer for voter education and outreach in the community. That's a relationship that the board continues to have with the local league, and I know Cindy is a part of this presentation tonight, so I'm sure she'll touch upon those, so I don't want to steal too much of her thunder, but they have been very helpful to the board. They serve to register our new citizens, and they also do voting registration drives, and they're very helpful to getting the word out with hosting events such as debates and meeting the candidates, and moderating debates at the chamber level, for example. So that really emerged in the 1960s and still continues. So it bridges the gap between the past and the present. In the 70s and the 80s, the Voting Rights Act of 1970 was felt in Ulster County when the voting age dropped from 21 to 18. At the local board, it was noted in that annual report that special enrollments were exceptionally heavy in 1971 due to the passage of the 26th Amendment. That year, 3,081 18 to 21-year-olds registered in Ulster County, and that is reflected in our data and in that report. It was very impactful. It was emerged from the Vietnam War. Students and high school students, college students, their voices were definitely heard. It was the fastest passed amendment in the history of the United States Constitution. In 1974, that was the first year, I think this one is interesting, that in New York State, absentee voting was expanded in primary elections. Before that, in order to vote in a primary election, you had to present yourself in person to cast that ballot. Absentee voting has been expanded a lot since the Civil War when it first was established, and it took this long to allow for people to participate in primary elections through absentee balloting processes. So I thought that was quite interesting. In 1975, state laws were also changed to allow for voters to register through the mail. As an election administrator, voter registration is typically facilitated through the mail and through the DMV. So the fact that before then, everyone had to register locally, either at the central board or at their town clerk offices previous to 1975, that made voter registration difficult for people. Now you can just mail your registration in and not think about it. That year also saw changes in absentee voting for federal overseas voters. Those are voters who live overseas full-time, and they are only allowed to vote in presidential contests, US Senate and US Congress. They get a special ballot. That continues to this day. We have special protections for those voters who are overseas, military overseas voters. Previous to that, they couldn't vote. They'd have to come home to cast that ballot. One thing that was in the reports during this era was really focused, and it's disheartening to read these sections for myself, that the board was united, both Democrat and Republican commissioners were united in suppressing student voting at our college campuses, particularly at SUNY New Paltz. In 1973, the board was involved in multiple lawsuits, both at the state and federal level. I can tell you having a federal lawsuit as a local board is not something that typically occurs. So the fact that this was happening and that there were so many lawsuits, it is very telling that they were very firm in not wanting these students to register in 1980. So there were many lawsuits that resulted. This was the first time I see it in those files. In 1980, there was another lawsuit about student registration at SUNY New Paltz, and they sort of put it into a fiscal lens, saying that had the commissioners permitted the students to register, the county would have had to have picked up a large amount of welfare payments. What has happened since then, and a lot of these lawsuits continued through the early 2000s, is we now have a permanent polling site at SUNY New Paltz, but we do see a lot of these arguments still happening in 2020. For example, across the river in Dutchess County, the establishment of a polling location at Bard has been in the news, and it's being prevented at the board level in Dutchess County. This is a piece of legislation that was also discussed this year in the state legislature, mandating that polling locations be established at universities and colleges that have a certain percentage or a certain number of students that live on campus. So this is an ongoing thing that we see, and it really started in earnest post the 26th Amendment and when students started to mobilize on college campuses. The next 2 decades, the 80s and 90s, are really not too many pieces of legislation that still impact us, but the biggest innovations were in the sphere of technology. When you think of elections, you probably don't think of technology first and foremost, but it is something that is a major part of the work that we do. We oversee the largest resource of technological components in the county government. So it is something that really started in earnest in the 1980s with technological advancements. The commissioners at the time, Pete Zavago and Harry Castiglione, they speak to this in their reports about the computerization of the voter database, making that easier for the clerical staff at the time, switching over to electronic typewriters and starting to have a relationship with the County Department of Information Services. I think that it's something that we continue to see, obviously, now with the work that we do, but this was really the foundations of all of those improvements. Automation of voter notice cards. Beforehand, they were hand typed by clerical staff. That is now an automated process. Absentee label printing was introduced, which is quite an effort to get accurate absentee ballots out to voters. And they also made advancements in their election night reporting, doing that at the county office building, using a fax machine to report telephone results in from polling locations. These reports, I think, are also interesting in that they don't criticize outright the voting machines that they had at the time, which were the lever machines, but having the hindsight of knowing that those lever machines had huge problems that really did not come to the forefront until the year 2000, you see examples of these problems through the 80s and the 90s. There were a lot of warning signs in these reports that these voting systems were not accurately counting results and that they were susceptible to manipulation. They were stored at the municipal level throughout the year. That is something that would never happen now. They are all under the lock and key of the central board. Custodians were hired much like election inspectors for the one day of work. So they had a very brief training they were not full-time staff, and they were in charge of essentially the votes getting counted, and that didn't always happen. There were many reports in which the results were very close. There was a sheriff's race that was very close, and that resulted in a lot of impoundment of the voting systems after the election. So on election night, a judge would order that those machines had to be impounded. Now, the way that those machines work is that they had paper rolls. So you would have to unfurl the whole roll and see where all of the punches were. That is not the best way of recounting an election. And it was very difficult at the time. There's still people around that had a lot of experience with this. Kathy Meem, Judy Horvers, they tell us horror stories of how difficult it was to really drill down and look at those results, especially when they were very close and the results would make a difference in elections throughout the whole county. So you see warning signs of this, but they're not blatant because they didn't want to, I guess, raise alarm bells. But when I look at them, I see, oh yeah, this is very much what you see on the horizon later into the end of the 90s. In the 90s, again, more technological innovations. This was, it's sort of funny to look back and see that they established a website in the 90s and how new and different that was. There were a lot of changes too to how they standardized the street file management. So figuring out where a certain voter, what election district they live in, standardizing the 911 street file was implemented in 1993, and it was a lot of work at the board level, something that they never really had to do. They used to work with the assessors, and then everybody's addresses changes that year, so it took a lot of work. They had to hire 63 part-time workers that year to go through and update everybody's address through the 911 change. Digitization of signatures happened that year. That also allowed them, because that took place, they were allowed to move away from permanent poll book files over that would have the buff cards, people's original voter records. They would sign every year to sign in the logbook in order to get their ballot and go into the voting booth. That changed over that decade, where they would use a brand new book for every election, which would then become historic records. So there was no way to change the original document. The voter never had access to that after that, which is, it's a good thing. It prevents a lot of manipulation, changes, things that could have gone missing. So moving over into having those poll books changed that way, I think must have been a big change for them with a lot of work, but that work was very much well worth it. So that it's interesting to read back and see how they talk about all of the work that it took, but we still see those effects today. I can look back at a voter's file and see the digitization of those records. We can go back and look at people's records from this era, from the 90s. So they also launched the website, and they introduced a centralized computer-based voter database. Before then, it was all very much on those 80s based typed buff cards. Probably the biggest piece of legislation in the 90s was the National Voter Registration Act, which also known as Motor Voter of 1993. This is a huge advancement. It's still something that is incredibly impactful to the way that we conduct our elections now. It prohibits states from removing voters from the voter roll unless they meet specific criteria, like prolonged inactivity, missing more than 2 federal elections. And even bigger than that is that voters are permitted to register and update their registration through the DMV. This is something that has continued to shape and change. We now get more registrations through the DMV electronically than we get any form of registration. It has been incredibly expanded. It's very easy. It gives people the access to update their records so that we have a more accurate voter roll than we ever had before this piece of legislation was passed. I think it's the history of this piece of legislation is actually very interesting in that there was an unusual alliance between the recording industry and the politicians of the time. The group REM essentially conducted a huge petitioning effort using the way that people were buying their music in CDs, the long boxes. They had petitions printed on them where voters would fill them out, send them to their local representatives, and then they carted hundreds and thousands of these petitions to the floor of Congress, and it made a big impact. So it really showed how impactful young voters have been in the way that election reforms have changed throughout the years. Now, in the early 2000s, another huge piece of legislation was the Help America Vote Act, which we call HAVA. That was passed in 2002 by President George Bush. That really was a result of the 2000 election, and that ushered in a brand new era. Probably the biggest thing that we've seen in the modern election system is the reform that resulted from HAVA. A lot of money was granted to the counties, to the states across the country to get rid of old technology like the lever machines and replace them with new voting systems. I'd also established the Election Assistance Commission, which is a group that still helps us to this day. They give us all kinds of resources. This HAVA is so impactful. We talk about it 20 years later. It's huge piece of legislation that we still have HAVA money that we're using to train poll workers, to purchase equipment. It was massive. However, in New York State, it did take a long time for them to switch to new voting technology. They were criticized at the time. The state was criticized for taking so long. Eventually, there was a period of time from 2006 to 2010 or 2009 where both lever machines and ballot marking devices were used together in poll sites. There would be a special ballot marking device for voters who needed that, but most of the voters were still voting on the lever machines. That didn't fully phase out until 2010. In 2005, the county board assumed all election responsibilities from the municipalities, really ending that reliance on the town clerks, including really securing polling locations, and election inspectors is now full function of the Ulster County Board of Elections, and that's the way it is across the state. Another major change to local boards in this era was the hiring of full-time voting system technicians added to staffs of Board of Elections across the state of New York. This really centralizes the maintenance of the voting systems. It allows for annual testing, for accuracy, making sure that the votes are counted, and since it is paper-based, it is a very accurate system, which right here, you can see an example. This is what you see when you go to vote in Ulster County, and in a lot of places, a lot of us use this same voting system. This was purchased with HAVA money, this fleet of voting systems. It's a paper-based voting system, so now there's a paper ballot for every voter. The state of New York, even though they did take a long time to certify these voting systems, they really are a standard bearer across the country. A lot of states at the time went with touchscreen technology. States like Pennsylvania, they've had to since purchase new voting systems. New York State opted to go the paper-based route, which really allows us to audit and run recounts very accurately and efficiently. In the 10 years that we've been using this technology, we've had audits for every election, and those audits come out 100% accurate every single time. So I know a lot of people miss the old curtain and the ding noise that it made, but at least now we can be confident that our votes are being counted and that those can also be verified after after the fact, so people can have the confidence that their votes are being cast and counted accurately. And now this decade has been very much sweeping reforms on the state level, bringing us into a lot of what other states have seen with the use of early voting that we launched last year, and also in some local aspects. Local recount laws were passed. We never really fully practiced the local recount law until last year with the DA's race. There's recount laws that are being established on the state level that take effect next year, which really looked at the local laws that Ulster had. There's Ulster and 2 other counties that have recount laws. So they looked at what we do in Ulster County to really base what they're going to do on the state level. And that legislation is very much mirrors what we do here in Ulster. But yes, early voting, very big deal. Because of early voting, we now have new technology. Gone are the paper-based poll books that were implemented in the 90s, replaced by iPad technology, the poll pad. This allows for us to have voters go to any early voting site, and that is captured in real time and sent back to the board so that we can have an open site plan, which makes it easier for voters to access early voting. We also use them at all of our poll sites on election day, and it creates a better situation for us to be able to certify and close out the election in a much faster and accurate fashion. The biggest issues of this decade have been in the cybersecurity realm, especially since the 2016 presidential election. There's a major emphasis on the security of elections since we have moved into new technology since really starting at the late 70s up through today. So for Ulster County, that means a lot of relationships with groups like the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, both the state and the federal actors on that level, having exercises for cybersecurity breakdowns, things that can happen in different scenarios. So we stress test and audit our election systems to make sure that they would withstand an attack like that. This is the modern challenge in election administration, is cybersecurity. So there's a heightened awareness. However, despite all of these actions and measures, there's still opportunities for hacking to occur. Ransomware attacks have been seen on other election offices that really frees up their ability to run their poll books, because their county has been the victim of a ransomware attack. So because of those things happening, we have backups of all of our poll books so that we could rebuild the election, even if we don't have access to the original files. But really what they harp on right now, what we get white papers on a daily basis, is the continued spread of misinformation on social media and how we grapple with that on the election level. All of the questions that we get now are usually followed up with, I heard it on Facebook, or someone told me that they saw it on Twitter. And what we have to deal with constantly on the election level is those kinds of misinformation attacks. So we're constantly trying to get out there, let people know what their rights are, what they can do. Now, I think that it's important to look at what will likely happen in the next few years to change the election system even more. We are very much in a reform era, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1960s. So it's not over yet. So essentially, we are through a constitutional amendment period right now, where in 2019, the state legislature passed automatic voter registration bills. That will go on the ballot next year. If they pass it in January of 2021, it will be on the ballot in November of 2021 as a referendum. This will allow for voters to register automatically. They will have to opt out if they don't want to be registered. Some states do this. They've found great success in having better and accurate voter registration rolls due to automatic voter registration. Then also this year, because of the pandemic, there's been a renewed interest in voting through the mail. And that's distinctive from what we have now. What we have now in New York State is absentee balloting. That has been expanded this year due to the pandemic through legislative action and executive orders from the governor. However, it's put a new lens on voting by mail, and it is very much being talked about by the politicians and the powers that be that go and change our laws in the state level. So it's something that we on the ground level are very mindful of, and something that we're looking at the changes that could come down the road. So I was asked to also explain how you can vote and how you can register. I hope everybody on this call is registered to vote. The registration cutoff date is October 9th, which is fast approaching. In about a week, we'll be closing our voter registration rolls. Those who are not registered or do not have an updated registration, you can do that online. If you have a driver's license number, you can register to vote right online through the Department of Motor Vehicles. If not, you can do the paper application and make sure that you get that in by October 9th. And then we have a lot of ways that you can vote. So absentee balloting has been expanded because of COVID. It's been expanded for the reason of COVID being expanded is temporary illness. So we have a lot of voters who are citing that as the reason that they would like to vote that way. We have broken records already this year in our June primary. We issued 17,000 absentee ballots. That is twice as much as we've ever issued before. We are at that number now for this election, October 1st. We have about 17,000 absentee applications on our system. I think that we'll actually double that before Election Day. People can now request their absentee ballot through an online web portal that the State Board of Elections has established. They can call the Board of Elections and ask for it directly. They can email us. They can come in person and get an absentee ballot. All of those things, aside from in-person registration for absentees, these are all brand new. We never had these before. And so a lot of people are engaging with this process for the first time, which means that they're also very confused about how to do the absentee ballot. So a lot of the outreach and a lot of the calls that we're getting right now are how to do your absentee ballot, how to send it back, make sure that it gets counted, and anxiety around the post office. So we have contactless drop boxes at our location in Kingston, and they'll also be at our early voting centers and all of our poll sites. People can vote early. It's still a brand new thing, so I don't think a lot of people are aware of what early voting is and what it looks like. It's just like voting in person on Election Day, but it's for the 9 days before the election. So it starts October 24th. But instead of going to the poll site that you're assigned to, like you do on Election Day, you go to your neighborhood polling location, we have 5 early voting centers, and any voter can go to any of those centers to cast their ballot because of the new technology that we purchased last year when we implemented that program. So our sites are the Woodstock Community Center, the Midtown Center in Kingston, the Highland American Legion, the New Paltz Community Center, and the Ellenville Public Library. So voters can go and engage with an in-person balloting experience. They can do that. There's usually less lines than there are on Election Day, and you can just put it into the regular schedule that you have. We have different hours for the different days. On the weekends, it's 10 to 3. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, it's 9 to 5. Tuesday and Thursday are our late nights, so that's 12 to 8. And we really hope that people really take advantage of early voting. It's a way to know that your ballot has been cast. Those votes are counted on election night, just like the Election Day voting ballots are. So when you hear the results on election night, if you vote early, your vote is included in those tallies. And then we have still Election Day voting. The Election Day, you do have to go to your assigned polling location. That's from 6 to 9, our traditional Election Day experience. And that's on Tuesday, November 3rd. During the pandemic, we have had to make a lot of changes in how we do our in-person voting and how we conduct it. So we field tested this in June. We have a PPE program at all of our polling locations. It was successful in June. Thankfully, no one contracted COVID, and we're very happy about that. So we're implementing that in this month for early voting, as well as on November 3rd. And we think it's very safe. We think it's safe. We think that people, if they're comfortable, you should choose the way that you want to vote. All of these three options are all treated equally by the Board of Elections. But if you choose to vote in person, you can do so knowing that it is as safe as we can make it. So masks are required, social distancing markers are in place, and those are all New York PAWS requirements at all of our poll sites and early voting centers. So I love the job that I do. I love facilitating the vote for Ulster County. Throughout the years, you can see that it's been a challenge. It's not an easy job to facilitate the vote. It is the largest public facing event that the government holds, is our election days, and a lot of things can happen. The tragedy of 9/11 happened on an election day, which is something that a lot of people forget. So that morning, people were voting in a primary, and you never know what can happen. We plan for everything that we can do, but anything can happen. But really, it's what makes our country great, is democracy. And I know everybody on this call is going to vote. So if you have any questions, I'll stick around. But that's it for me.
Thanks a lot, Ashley. That was a lot to digest in a short period, but that was great. Thank you. So we still have a speaker to go. I know I advertised this as 7 to 8:30, but I hope that people can stick around. We still have Cindy Bell, who's the president of the League for Women Voters. And I can't wait to hear what she has to say. And then we also have a question and answer period. So please stick around if you can. And Cindy is, can we, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. All right. Well, my stuff fits in pretty much where, everyone else's stuff, but I don't have a PowerPoint. So I'm doing things old school. I have a script. I do want to say that Ashley and the Board of Elections, they are better than any Board of Elections in the state. And they've done an amazing job making sure that the voting process is secure and safe, and they are easy to work with. And our systems, the league actually worked to choose the system in New York State, which came 9 years late, but it turned out to be the best system as far as I can tell in the country. There have been no problems, and so it was worth the wait. So now I'm going to go back and start where I was going to start. Carrie Chapman Catt's pivotal leadership role in garnering the right to vote for women led to her presidency of the National American Women's Suffrage Association after women got the right to vote in New York in 1917, as you know. Catt first proposed the idea for the League of Women Voters at the association's annual convention the following year. The idea was to have women who had the right to vote help enfranchise women in other states. She also envisioned the League as a transition mechanism that would educate women in citizenship. Catt's idea gained momentum as the other suffragist leaders recognized that the vote alone would not be enough to advance the rights of women. She again proposed the idea at the 1919 convention, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association officially became the League of Women Voters. The League was to continue the work of the association in guaranteeing women the right to vote, and to expand that work to include removing discriminatory laws and improving government for the common good. The League's work has continued well after the passage of the 19th Amendment. As it grew in membership and respect, it has played an important role in educating the voting public on the crucial issues in good government. In the 1940s, at President Roosevelt's request, the League carried out a nationwide public support campaign to establish the United Nations. President Harry Truman then invited the League to serve as a consultant to the U.S. delegation, the first organization officially recognized by the UN as a non-governmental organization, or NGO. The League's work with the United Nations continues with annual briefings for League members and reports from observers. The topic of the session in the fall of 2019 was global climate change, and I was lucky enough to go to that, and it was really well done. An amazing event, and I wouldn't miss another one. The League of Women Voters maintains a special consultancy status due in part to the early involvement of Eleanor Roosevelt, who crafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and held the position of legislative director for the National League during her tenure at the UN. In the 1950s, the League recognized the need to separate its issue advocacy from its educational role. It established the Education Fund to encourage the active and informed participation of citizens in government and to increase understanding of major public policy issues. Its advocacy for good government and non-discrimination continues, and leagues across the nation focus on both efforts. What has always been important to the League is its grassroots origin. Like its predecessor, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the League is not now, nor has it ever been, solely a national organization. Rather, in addition to the National League, each state has its own state league, and within each state, there are multiple local leagues. In New York, for example, there are currently 47 leagues. The Dutchess County Equal Suffrage League became the Women's City and County Club, which in 1925 became the Dutchess County League of Women Voters. This is largely due to the efforts of Laura Johnson Wiley, an alumnus and teacher at Vassar College. At the time, local conversation centered around a study for a new high school in Poughkeepsie, the need for housing authority there, world trade, tariffs, and child welfare. By the 40s, the League was holding meetings to discuss the refugee problem created by World War II and to look at the Dutchess County Charter. In the mid-40s, the National League withdrew the Poughkeepsie's branch charter due to extreme partisanship among members, but were again granted provisional status in 1952 with full status in 1953. We are always totally nonpartisan, and everything we do is issues only and no parties ever. The Dutchess League successfully sued the Dutchess County Legislature on 2 occasions. The first was in 1970s on the grounds that the reapportionment plan violated the one man, one vote rule of the US Supreme Court, thereby establishing single member districting for the county rather than the current at-large seats. This resulted in citizens being able to have and call on their own representatives. The second was in 1980, when the grounds of racial inequality, since the redistricting plan was based on voter registration rather than census population. New district lines are now based on census figures. The Dutchess League disbanded in the 1990s due to declining membership and a lack of leadership. These members were invited to join the Mid-Ulster League, which was then renamed the League of Women Voters of the Mid-Hudson region. This brings me to the formation of the League of Women Voters in Ulster County. In the beginning, there were 4 separate leagues: Woodstock, New Paltz, which was chartered in the mid-50s, Kingston, chartered in 1960, followed shortly thereafter by Saugerties. The League's mission remained the same: to educate the public and encourage informed and educated active participation in government. These 4 leagues often collaborated in their efforts early on, creating and disseminating a book called The Handbook of Ulster County. I don't think I can. It is really quite an interesting book, which detailed demographics and specifics of county departments, much of which remains true today, and much of it is right out. The handbook, along with several town versions, were sold at grocery stores and purchased by businesses and banks to share with their patrons. Many were sold through the mail. Studies for library funding, a Kingston City charter, and the county's reapportionment process took place in the 1960s, along with several surveys to gauge public opinion and knowledge, with follow-up public meetings to share the results of the sometimes year-long efforts. In 1970, the League's Ulster County Charter Committee completed a 3-year study. The position taken by the League was yes on the charter, with no position on the need for a county executive. The Laws and Rules Committee, which considers new local laws before presentation to the legislature for a vote, would not take up consideration, citing a full calendar. The League countered by stating that this proved the point of need. This significant change in our government would not take place until 2008. Once the charter passed through the legislature, the League presented many informational events regarding the charter, as well as candidate forums from the new offices of executive and comptroller in order to educate the public on the changes. It was the League's first countywide lawn sign effort, which I hope to never do again, and was supported by a colorful brochure. We continue to keep our guardians of the Charter Committee on the lookout for the inevitable attempts at shifting the balance of power in county government, and have been working to extend those efforts to Dittus. And so we're watching. Waste management and the garbage crisis in Ulster County have been a priority for us for decades. Our member Shirley Cobran organized the very first Ulster County recycling event, collecting several tons of newspaper on the front lawn of the Kingston High School. By 1985, a county-wide recycling effort was online, and the first source separation efforts went through each town's transfer station. The League's primary participation was citizen education, although League members have had and continue to hold leadership roles in the county solid waste process. In 1987, the League of Women Voters of Mid-Ulster strongly objected to the proposed use of plastic shopping bags by grocery stores, an event that failed at the time. Sorry, I gotta plug myself in here. 2019 saw a single-use plastic bag ban, a law written and promoted by a League member who at the time was also the chair of the county legislature. That would be Tracy Bartels, and thank you very much. This local law was followed by a state ban keeping uncounted billions of carcinogenic plastic bags from clogging recycling machines, rivers, forests, and human bodies. This was a win for everyone. In 1989, the League submitted a 5-page public comment on the generic environmental impact statement for the solid waste management program of the Ulster County Resource Recovery Agency. Composting was listed as the sleeping giant of solid waste management. Today, it is the single largest focus of the education arm of the Resource Recovery Agency, working to eliminate organic waste, which comprises 30% of our waste in landfills. Our March program earlier this year was called Wasted. It was all about food waste and pointed to the fact that a head of lettuce can take up to 20 years to decompose in the anaerobic atmosphere in landfills, which was shocking for everyone that was there. The good news is that there's progress in this area, and at least commercial compost can be put to good use and never has to see a landfill. In the early 60s, the National League spoke out against the poll tax, which as a form of voter suppression still existed in the country, creating a further obstacle for many deeply impoverished people in southern states. The League still speaks out against voter suppression efforts and primarily uses public education and lawsuits in order to effect change. We're fortunate to have a good relationship with our boards of elections in order to communicate and stay abreast of today's issues. And for that, we thank Ashley, and we have always had a good relationship with Tom and now with John. A study took place in the mid-60s to address the unnecessary complexity of the family court system. Families under duress endured appearances in up to 5 different courts for the same problem. In 1986, the Ulster County Family Court requested the League perform an official study for it. This entailed 6 weeks of daily appearances, staffed by 18 League monitors from all over the county, and it included a written follow-up report, resulting in the move to the Lucas Avenue space, creating room for private consultation and childcare areas. There were also suggestions for soundproofing, panic buttons, handicapped restrooms, and seating that separated petitioners. The League's Observer Corps began locally in 1962 with members sitting in on governmental meetings and issuing written or verbal reports on their observations. Members choose a group that's consistent with their personal interest and are observers only, though better behavior and more work done tends to be the norm when a member is sporting a League button. We have often spoken at public comment periods about local issues consistent with League positions. The nature of the Observer Corps changes with the times and the need for the public to know what is happening when they are not watching. Ulster County voters were required to register to vote each and every year until permanent personal registration was adopted locally in 1964. All residents needed to re-register, many for the last time. The Ulster County League swung into action and registered thousands that year. In 1971, the Have You Registered booklet was published as a result of the voting age being lowered to 18 and was given out to prospective young voters. Also in 1971, women's given names were finally seen in news coverage and captions in the Daily Freeman, despite the many requests made by League members over the years. Previously, women had been known only as Mrs. John Smith rather than Mary Smith. In 1973, men were welcomed into the League of Women Voters. A name change was seriously contemplated in 1976, but rejected for fear that men would come in and run roughshod over League policy and relegate women to second place. This source goes on to say that if men want to participate, they'll have to prove themselves patiently, the same as women have always had to do. 1975 saw local support of the Equal Rights Amendment as well as for the first bottle bill, reducing discarded drink containers being found on roadsides throughout the county. The ERA has yet to be ratified despite the requisite number of states signing on to the bill this year. A local televised debate was held for the first time in the county in 1986 on Cablevision, which was new that year. It featured candidates for the offices of county sheriff, state senator, and congressman. Our League member, Len Kane, moderated the event. In 1988, the League of Women Voters of the United States dropped out of national debates. The League's president stated, "The League's goal is to inform voters. The party's goal is to get their candidates elected. We have different motives. We have no intention of becoming an accessory to the hoodwinking of the public," later calling the proposed format as a, quote, charade. So, and I wrote this before this week's debate. Early tools for citizen engagement included student essay contests with a United Nations theme, skits and folk singers with timely messages and surveys to gauge interest and knowledge of various public issues. Many brochures or booklets were written and distributed. Public meetings were held to present the results of studies, many times with backing by expert commentary. Since voter education and voters' rights have always been front and center of our League efforts, the New York State League annually publishes Facts for Voters, a guide to statewide voter information and candidate positions. They were distributed throughout the 2 counties each fall, reaching a high point with 22,000 brochures in 1979. The Mid-Hudson Region League now holds an annual voters rally featuring local offices and candidates not covered by the league's state publications. This year, our voters rally will be virtual, and anyone is welcome. Through the 90s, the local leagues continued to educate the public with voter registrations, candidate events, and self-published information on local governments and issues. Youth involvement in government was encouraged through a statewide citizen bee and through Students Inside Albany. This ongoing program engages young people in the democratic process through visits to their state elected officials during a 3-day conference featuring speakers to help students understand the process of governing. Other study items were balancing justice and alternatives to incarceration, which hit a wall when no agency, either county or state, would provide information on whether or not any of these programs are effective. We believe that the recidivism rate of participants was not shared because it was not known and no one wanted to admit it. County officials continued to stymie efforts to create a fair and independent redistricting. We continued to bring it up every 10 years. The first independent redistricting commission took place in 2010 after institution of the Ulster County Charter. Our members continue to be involved as a part of the commissions, and anyone can see, if you look at our legislative map in Ulster County, it's the only one that makes any sense. So because demographics and citizen priorities were a major part of the transparent and public process. There are no more gerrymandered districts here, and Ulster County has been a beacon of how to get it right, being the first in the state and in the vanguard nationally. This example has been followed by Dutchess County with a similar law on their ballot this year. We're very excited. Other recent activities include programs focusing on election security, tenant rights, fake news, the Electoral College, and how to run for office. And I thank Nina for being part of the last one. The Mid-Hudson Region League offers a range of topics of current local interest as well as those of national importance. I could go on for hours about how the League has lifted and shifted political conversations, provided numerous useful trainings, and has always encouraged community and citizen involvement. We continue to work on many of the same issues as we have over the last 50 plus years. We are patient and we are persistent. If we wish to maintain our quality of life in government, it takes work, and we are equal to the task. The year of COVID has provided additional challenges, and as we work together to take advantage of the technical tools afforded us, these challenges are real, not just for leadership, but for everyone. The current divisive political atmosphere on every level has made our job just that much harder, although we tend to keep on doing what we do best. Our membership is stronger than ever before. We are a fiscally healthy organization due to the tremendous talents and generosity of our members, who are educators, doctors, elected officials, community activists, and concerned citizens. Our online voter resource, vote411.org, is live right now and contains personalized information on registration status, deadlines, polling place information, and candidate statements to help voters make their choice. You may see the rear bus wraps going up very soon promoting our vote411.org. The League's role in government today is at least as essential as any other point in history, and perhaps more so with the recent breakdown of norms and mistrust of our most basic institutions. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the support of Hugh Reynolds, whose frequent mentions of League activities and positions as a journalist and a popular political columnist help keep our organization vibrant and present in the public eye. This record has provided a critical resource in marking our history. On the 40th anniversary of our League, Hugh wrote, "It's hard to believe that we waited until 1920 before reluctantly giving the voting rights to half our citizens." We agree. And we still work diligently to safeguard that right for all. I would also like to acknowledge the late Shirley Cobran, creator and keeper of our history scrapbooks, and Nina Postupek, Ulster County Clerk and longtime League member, for agreeing to preserve those scrapbooks in the county archives. I'm still pouring through them, working to write a history of this august group of women and men. Many thanks to Ellie Charwatt for her history of the Duchess League, and to Jennifer Clark for her research on the earliest days of the League. Finally, I would like to extend my deep appreciation for your kind attention. Election Day is November 3rd, so check your information at vote411.org, and don't forget to vote. More about our local league can be found at lwvmidhudson.org. And I thank you. And thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks a lot for that history, and it's great. So it's late, but we do have questions. So I'm going to turn now to Susan Sprackman, who's going to ask a few. And
okay. So far, we only have 3 questions, which is good because it's late at night. And I'm going to ask the most volatile one, or most interesting one perhaps first. What are plans if President Trump's poll watchers descend on one of our voting places and attempt to intimidate voters?
This one's for me.
That's for you.
Actually, go for it. Yeah.
So we do have a plan in development with the Sheriff's Department and law enforcement. We're not going to have law enforcement at the poll sites because that in itself is a form of intimidation, but they are ramping up their staffing for that day on election day, and they will be a stone's throw away from all of our poll sites in order to create a environment where people feel that they are safe. We have election laws that prohibit any campaigning, electioneering, we call it, within the poll site and 100 feet outside of the site. But beyond the 100 feet, especially if people are waiting in any lines, we don't want anybody to be aggressively attacking them. Poll watchers are permitted to be in the poll site. They do have to be authorized by their party leadership. If anybody breaks the rules that poll watchers are very much strictly enforced in New York State, you cannot talk to voters. You are just there to observe. If they are intimidating voters, we have the power to eject them from the site, and we have a plan in place with Sheriff Figueroa, other town police, municipal police agencies. So I feel that we have a good plan in place. We're going to put out a statement letting the public know that this is something we're planning for. So hopefully that will dissuade anybody from attempting to do such a thing. We will not tolerate it. Same thing with if you're not going to wear a mask, you have to wear a mask.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment? Any of our other speakers?
I'm an election inspector, and I think the rules are clear and the training is always there. And I'm confident that we won't have a problem. Even if somebody tries, they're very supportive.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. The next one is also for Cindy. Where did the League of Women Voters evolve? What organization did it evolve from? And good.
Yeah.
And also, can you talk a little bit about working on climate change?
Oh, it's a big one for us.
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm used to that. I moderate and keep time. So it evolved from the National American Woman Suffrage Association after women got the vote, and that's where it came from. Climate change, I have to tell you, the UN event that I went to last fall was all about climate change, but we're leaguers and we know stuff. So they didn't really, get into what we already know. We were already scared. What they did was they offered hope. Actually, there are people doing things in the world that that are making a difference, and there was very positive. Locally, we manage Joe Green and Tracy Bartels. We have a group that's that's interested in the local issues. Everything's local. So recycling and those types of events, you know, we support. I mean, we got out there and talked a lot about the plastic bag thing. And of course, now we're at, you know, there's more straws are necessary. So, you know, a lot of this is taking a back seat. But it's, for me, it's what brought me to the League. And, you know, because I felt like a lone wolf. I thought, oh, the sky's falling and nobody's helping. But it's really not that way. So there's a lot going on locally, nationally, internationally about climate change. And the League is very deeply involved in it.
Okay, thank you. The next one probably is for you, Joan. Somebody asked, they're researching about African Americans in the Hudson Valley. How can they determine, you know, anything beyond what you've mentioned? How and when they were allowed to vote?
Yeah, I get this question. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
I get questions quite often like, is this person the first person who voted in Watertown or Marbletown or whatever? So if anyone knows of a place where the election rolls might be hiding, Taylor and I looked all over to see if we could find, there doesn't seem to be the books that we're used to today. You go to vote and there's your book with your name in it. In the 1860s and 70s, we don't seem to have a record of individual voters. If you do look in the 1865 and 1875 census, they do list every individual in the house, and it does put a mark by those that are allowed to vote. So that would be my recommendation of where to go to look, unless one of the local historians here knows where to find voter rolls, which I would really like to know about.
Yeah, I suggest if since it is late and probably we don't want to have a lot of dialogue at this point, if anybody has any of those ideas, if you send them to Jeff, maybe then Jeff can distribute them to
Great.
the people who were on this call. Okay. Any other quick questions that somebody hasn't written in that they'd like to offer? I'll take silence as it's 9 o'clock and we're all ready to have a glass of wine or get ready for bed.
Yeah, just a few last points. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to all the presenters and to the committee for setting this up, and to all of you good folks who pushed register and came and joined us, and for staying long after the published end time. That's great. I also wanted to let you know that the video of this presentation will be available on YouTube, and I hope to have it posted to my website within a couple of days. So if you go to the Ulster County Historian on the county webpage, there should be a link there for this as well soon. And so please look for that. I don't know if there's anything else that anyone wants to say before we close.
Oh, Jeff, I just two late questions came in. One for Ashley. Have you received many calls regarding not trusting or fraud when it comes to voting by mail? And just a general question about a connection between the push for prohibition and the suffrage movement. Maybe we could just take a few moments on those.
So we have heard a lot of anxiety. Our phones ring all day long with a lot of people that are concerned about their ability to get their ballot in with all of the news about the post office, and also concerns, does my vote count? The state has made a reform that just came down in August to ensure that if there is a mistake on someone's absentee ballot, we're bound by law to let them know and have them cure that defect. If their ballot is not counted, they're also going to be told that. That was never the case before. So voters should be assured that there are remedies for issues. So far, we've received a lot of ballots back. We've started issuing them last week, and we go through those every single day to make sure that they are meet the standards, and when we go to count, that they will be counted. So that's what we're telling the public. I'm doing a video tomorrow with Spectrum News showing people exactly how to fill out the absentee ballots so that they can avoid any of those mistakes. So it's a bit of a lift as far as dispelling a lot of the misinformation that's out there, especially when it's coming from, you know, a lot of it's coming from the president himself. So that's hard to deal with, but it's something that we're doing the best that we can. And we just ask for people to be patient with us. A lot of people are asking for absentees, and so we do that so that we issue them. We don't just send them out without making sure that everything was done to the standards that the law sets. So it does take a little bit of time. So we have about 4,000 that are on our system now that we're going to try to get out by Monday, but we have about that much coming in on a weekly basis with really no end to the rate on the scale that we've been asked to produce. So it's been a very challenging year with the pandemic, with everything going on with the election, but so far, really no big issues to report. Everything is going well. The post office is delivering things in a timely fashion. I asked for an absentee just to test the system, and I got it within 3 days of us putting them in the mail. So I thought that was pretty great. So things are going smoothly. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. We're there. We answer the phone. We'll talk to everybody. And that's the kind of board that we run. So.
And I think, given how late it is, the very interesting question about prohibition and suffrage, I'll make the executive decision to put that aside because I think everybody's tired. So back to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks a lot. Once again, I call this second mini conference hereby complete. And I thank you again for coming out and for staying the course. And we will keep you updated and you about future conferences. And you should have the tape of this soon, the link for the video. Okay, thank you and good night. And we'll see you.